Hello and welcome to our Unenlightenment podcast. My name is Eric English. I'm your resident philosopher, theologian, and ninja. Well, hey everyone, we have another great show for you here today. I have with me Dr. Kristin Du Mez. Did I pronounce that right? Is it Du Mez?
You did, yes.
All right, good. Dr. Du Mez is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She's the author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. She's also a fellow Patheos columnist. She is with us here today. Welcome, Kristin.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, before we begin, I should mention to those who are listening that I'm issuing a trigger warning for this podcast. Some of the stuff that we will be talking about could be triggering for those who have encountered any kind of abuse by the church. So I just wanted to give that as a upfront warning to anybody who is watching and listening. So let's begin. Kristin, hey, your book wrecked me just a little bit. I'm not sure if that's the intention, but I'm a huge critic of evangelicalism. I read a lot, and I will tell you there was no cheering on my part as I was reading through your book. By the end, I was discouraged and I was saddened and felt a little hopeless. That's not to say that I find your book incredible. So not to like down it and then say, like we're advertising it here because we want people to read it because it is a great book. It is incredible. I feel like it provides proof for things that me and others have been saying for so long, but just not really had the history that you bring to really show why evangelicalism is in the situation it is. So let me start off by asking you, why did you decide to write this book?
I originally started to explore the topic of evangelical masculinity back in the early 2000s, actually. So I had been teaching a course on U.S. history, had lectured on Teddy Roosevelt to show my students at Calvin how interesting gender was in history, how ideas of masculinity change over time, how they're linked to not just religion, but to race and empire. And it was this great little lecture, I thought. And after that class, a couple of Calvin students came up to me, a couple of guys from the class, and said, Professor Du Mez, there's this book that you really have to read. And that book was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And at that time, it was this best-selling book. It would go on to sell more than 4 million copies. Every Christian guy I knew was reading it in some sort of book study. And sure enough, I opened the book and he opens with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt and goes on to sketch this vision of Christian manhood that is very militaristic. So every man has a battle to fight. And this was in the early years of the Iraq War, actually. And so I was reading this literature, and at the same time, I was seeing all the survey data coming out, showing how white evangelicals were far and away more enthusiastic proponents of the Iraq War, of preemptive war in general, of torture. And so I just started to ask, what does one thing have to do with the other? I ended up setting the project aside for a long time, after researching it for about a year and a half, in part because what I was finding was so disturbing. This was also the era of Mark Driscoll, and I could just see his popularity and his misogyny. And so I really wasn't sure what I was looking at, frankly. It felt so extreme and extremist, and yet I could see how popular it was. And so I just wasn't quite sure how to figure out, is this mainstream or is this really fringe? So I set it aside for a while and ended up pulling the research out again in the fall of 2016 with evangelical support for Trump, and really kind of that question of what is mainstream and what is fringe had been answered for me. And the rhetoric that I heard around evangelical support for Trump reminded me so much of this kind of militant Christian manhood that I had glimpsed all those years ago. And that was really the moment then that I decided to take that research and turn it into the book that became Jesus and John Wayne.
So I know a lot of people who have read this book, and every one of them says the same thing, and that is that you've wrecked our childhoods. Like all we do is we think of that in our college years.
Yeah.
We think about a youth group and or Promise Keepers or college and Eldridge. I had all of his books. I read through all. I just consumed all that stuff, and now I feel grubby. But uh, evangelicals are not usually too fond of them being critiqued. What kind of reception have you received because of this book?
Yeah, that's the huge surprise. I did not anticipate that the book's biggest fans would be conservative evangelicals themselves, or former evangelicals, or just evangelicals generally. I did not anticipate that this book would hit so many people so personally, in a way that, I mean, as you said, it wrecked you. I've heard literally from hundreds and hundreds of readers. I'm guessing it's probably 700 or 800 now. I haven't even been able to collate this all. And they're telling me their life stories and how those stories map onto this book, and it's hitting them so personally. I think for a couple of reasons. One, this is a history of evangelical popular culture, and so it's different from a lot of the histories of evangelicalism that have been written. This is talking about James Dobson's focus on the family radio, and it's talking about men's retreats with your churches and the popular literature, and it's the evangelicalism that ordinary evangelicals experience. So I think it really connects with people's lives, but it also is, I think, shocking, even though it's so intimately familiar on the one hand, because they lived it. So many people tell me some version of, like one man wrote, I bumped into so many of these trees, but I never saw the forest. They never understood kind of how all these pieces fit together, what motivations were behind them, what impulses were actually kind of motivating this ideology, and were creating this culture that they were consuming. And so it's both like intimately familiar, and then also shocking to see what they participated in, and in many cases were complicit in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I was going to say that next too is just for our listeners a brief little. What I think you do here is, like you said, we all we've done in this culture is sort of we experience one thing at a time, but what your book does is it sort of lifts the lens up so that you can see that in the context of the larger history, and I think that pulls back the curtain and shows what's really working behind the scenes there.
Yeah.
Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I worked to do in this book was not just to situate, any given event or publication or individual in terms of this larger history, but also to really work to map out the networks, the connections, the behind the scenes endorsements, the who was promoting who was connected through which organizations, and really try to map out evangelicalism itself. So a lot of scholars before, I think, have tended to treat evangelicalism as a theology, right? So you ascribe to these particular theological doctrines and you're an evangelical. I'm a cultural historian, and so I was much more interested in mapping out evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement. So who are these people, and how do you come to self-identify as an evangelical? It may be through attending a particular church. It may be through consuming a lot of Christian radio and Christian publications, and it could be both. And I was really interested in trying to map out that popular culture, both in terms of who is producing this, and then also in terms of consumption, who was consuming this and what was their experience like.
So here's what I think is the $1 million question. Do these people know that they are complicit in this?
Yeah. So the ones who are writing to me, which is, a subset, seem to be very open to interrogating their own complicity, because I've been really impressed actually with the responses that I've received from the evangelicals who are reaching out to me, because many will say, this is the story of my life, but I never understood. But then they don't use that "I never understood" as a way of saying, not on me, right? I'm innocent. Not at all. They ask the next questions, which they need to be asking, which is, how could I not have understood, right? How could I? So what was being hidden from me? Understanding that they were gaining something from being in this system, that this was doing something for them, that it felt good to be told that, you are the best Christians ever, or that, to understand that there was certain power that was being given to some and being kept from others. And whiteness had to do with that. And so for white evangelicals to be confronting how much their faith tradition really has been shaped by an unexamined whiteness, this white racial identity, even as it was just kind of packaged and sold as just plain old Christianity. For many Christian men too, understanding the ways in which patriarchy has given them authority and affirmed them, even as it has silenced many women and marginalized many women. And that's precisely the kind of reckoning that I'm sensing right now, again, from the subset who decides it's worth writing to me and kind of confessing this, and also just thanking me as an author for making this story available to them in a way that they can then use to chart a different course forward.
So this also raises a question, seeing how to ask this the right way. What is driving, does theology drive the behavior, or is behavior driving the theology?
So theology and behavior or ideology, it can't be entirely kind of separated, honestly. But evangelicals will always say theology drives behavior, right? Theology drives your politics. Theology drives your values. Theology drives everything. Historically, that's not really defensible, right? That first of all, there is no pure theology. There is no kind of pure theological tradition that is evangelicalism, that is true evangelicalism. That's just not how religion works, and history will demonstrate that very clearly. So it's at the same time, theology does matter, right? Theology enters into these debates. It matters in different ways for different people. For people in the pews, it often matters a lot less than leaders might like to think. Theological literacy is actually quite low across evangelicalism, and evangelicals aren't alone in this. Theology certainly matters to certain evangelical theologians and leaders of organizations, right? They're going to be kind of battling things out. But even then, I think evangelicals tend to have a certain almost innocence or willful neglect of the ways in which their theological truths are in fact culturally informed. And so some of the examples, and this is what the book is kind of getting at, the subtitle when I talk about corrupted of faith, that's actually not a historical claim as much as it's a theological claim. And it's me kind of speaking directly to Bible believing evangelicals, right? Okay, you say to uphold you uphold the authority of the scriptures. You say that theology dictates everything. Well, let's look at some of this. What about biblical teachings of loving your neighbor as yourself, of loving your enemies, of turning the other cheek, of, we could go on and on. Those are just easily dismissed or set aside in the story that I tell by all sorts of leaders. What about the historical doctrine of the Trinity, to take a kind of blaring example, that certain conservative theologians are playing fast and loose with in order to instead, establish this, the subordination of women and the eternal subordination of the Son. These are the kinds of things that I bring out quite clearly in this book to contest that idea that evangelicals are all about scriptural authority. And that's the only thing you really have to know to understand who evangelicals are and what they believe. Theology is important to them, but that theology is always shaped by cultural and political allegiances. And that's really the story I tell here.
So one of the reasons that, and we're going to get into Trump here in a minute, one of the reasons that I asked that is because it seems like there's a lot of, and again, we'll get into the Trump thing in a little bit, but it seems like there's a lot of justification that takes place. And so the reason I asked that question was because I was wondering why do they feel the need to justify like Trump's behavior and his different things like that? And I got thinking, especially with right now, at least with the Me Too movement and stuff like that, we're getting a lot of people coming forward saying, look, I've been abused by my pastor or a leader in the church. And it's mostly women who are abused by men. And so this is going to sound like a strange question, but what's evangelicals' obsession with sex? So like homosexuality or abortion rights, male headship, purity culture, all the sexual misconduct, is this just a reflection of our culture's obsession with sex? Why? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. That's a huge question. It's not one that I have a great answer to because I've kind of come back to this a lot too. So I'll give some of my theories, but I don't have the definitive answer, honestly. I think that partly, sex is connected, certainly in 20th century evangelicalism, to notions of purity. And I mean, that might sound so obvious because we think sexual purity, but also just this idea more broadly of good versus evil. And we on this side of the divide, we are God's chosen people. And so we are naturally pure and righteous. And then the evil is outside. And so we need to maintain our purity. And sexuality is one of the ways that we do that. Maintaining our theological purity is another way that we do that. And so these dynamics of the evil is always out there. And so we need to guard ourselves with this perfect purity. That seems to be a kind of motif. Now, for me, I'm a Christian, but I grew up in the Calvinist tradition. And so I've always been a little skeptical of these notions of purity that seem operative, including in the area of sexuality, right? That you're sexually pure if you're a virgin, and then you have sex once and you're sullied forever, right? That doesn't really work with a kind of Calvinist understanding of human nature, that we're all just totally depraved. And so, all of our sexuality would be included in that, whether we've had sex or not. So that's like one direction that I take that. But then when I look at the history that I researched here, it just became clear to me how important gender difference was in the evangelical kind of worldview. Understanding of the way the world worked, particularly by mid-century. So they kind of built their faith and the certainty of their faith and biblical inerrancy and all of that on top of this notion of God-ordained gender difference. And that they gave that just really outsized significance. And then they built so much on top of that. So to be a man is to be a provider and a protector. And to be a woman is to be submissive and weak and very, very feminine. And that can mean also sexually, alluring. And men are naturally sexually aggressive. And again, so much is being built on top that is called biblical, called Christian, when in fact much of it is anti-biblical. It goes against clear teachings of the scriptures if you actually start looking at this more carefully. But that gender difference then ends up being, and sex is very much a part of that. Sexual difference, gender difference, that is the way they understand that God orders humanity, and patriarchal power is the linchpin of that. So it's intimately linked to patriarchal power, gender difference, and this vision of sexuality. Then we take a look at something like feminism, which is advocating for equality, or even more so, same-sex relationships, which are going to challenge this, truth, this foundational truth of this exaggerated gender difference, which again, they built orthodoxy on top of. And so historically, you can kind of see that happen. So they're going to defend that gender difference and everything they've packaged with it as a non-negotiable. So one of the things I did in the book is issues like abortion or LGBTQ rights could have been a much bigger part of the story I told. Instead, I think many readers have seen this, we can now understand how those issues became such hot button issues in a particular historical moment, in part by situating them as within this larger narrative where white Christian patriarchy must be upheld above everything else, and gender difference is critical to that.
So before I read your book, my theory was that it was the issue of abortion was really the sort of linchpin that held everything together. But I couldn't ever articulate why, especially because it goes back beyond Roe v. Wade. So it really couldn't have been abortion. And then you also point out the Ronald Reagan thing too, with Christians supporting him and his stance on that. But so that was a rude awakening, and I'm thankful for it, because now we have some sort of better understanding of what that linchpin really is. So why this militarism? What is it with John Wayne? Like, why? Yeah, what is it with John Wayne? I don't like. Why is that the thing for them?
Yeah. So full disclosure, I did not set out to write a book about John Wayne at all. But when I saw, when I first read Aldridge's book in the early 2000s, I was struck immediately by the fact that, again, Bible believing Christians here, the Bible wasn't really front and center in efforts to construct Christian masculinity. Instead, writers like Aldridge look to Hollywood heroes. So they look to Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. They look to mythical warriors or just random cowboys or soldiers. And then I just started to notice that John Wayne just kept popping up way more than I thought he should. And John Wayne is the icon of American masculinity. And like, we all know this, right? That is this understanding that clearly this is the touchstone here. And so then I got curious, and as a historian, kind of look back to the past, and why would John Wayne be such a kind of inspiring figure? And the whole story that I tell really needs to be contextualized in terms of Cold War history. So as evangelicals are really emerging, this kind of neo-evangelical movement with Billy Graham, National Association of Evangelicals, this is all happening in the early Cold War context. And then communism was seen as this very real threat, and communists were anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. And it was a very real military threat. So the defense against it needed to be military as well. And so if you read Billy Graham, or if you listen to what he was saying, and other evangelicals, they are really intent on kind of propping up American masculinity and Christian masculinity, which are kind of one and the same. Christians are the most faithful, right? And so they play this critical role in shoring up the strength of Christian America. And what's part of that is making sure that that American men are strong, that they stay strong, that they can defend the nation, that they can defend faith, family, and nation. And they weren't all that different from a lot of Americans in the 1940s and 1950s in upholding these values. But then by the 1960s, that's when you have, right, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, really starting to challenge some of these deeply held values. And that's when they feel like, and that's when everything's going wrong in Vietnam too. So American goodness, American greatness, all of that's coming into question for a lot of Americans. But that's when conservative white evangelicals really double down on these values, on traditional American masculinity, on this kind of white patriarchal authority, on toughness, because we need to be able to fight. And what is going wrong on those battlefields in Vietnam? It's the feminists, it's the liberals. They've emasculated our boys, and it's up to Christians to raise young boys into strong men. And this is where James Dobson comes in, and others, and they're very explicit about, you need to teach your kids to play with guns and then use real firearms. Your boys, sorry, not your kids, your boys, because we need to have men who can defend Christian America. And this is what John Wayne came to symbolize on screen and off by the 1960s, by the 1970s. He was a hero of conservative American masculinity, right? He was a symbol of standing up against the hippies, standing up against the liberals, the lefties. He was this iconic, kind of throwback masculinity to a time when all was right in the world, and that needed to be kind of recreated, restored. And that involves strong men who were willing to do what needed to be done, use violence when necessary in order to achieve order, to pursue righteousness. And John Wayne became a symbol of that in American conservatism, and he ultimately became a symbol of that also for conservative evangelicals.
That must have been when America was good again.
Yeah, right. It's this, make America great again. This MAGA nation, that is only the latest iteration. And that's something that was really striking when I was researching this book. You've got kind of previous iterations of that, very similar, restore American greatness, and coming over and over again. It's part of this Christian nationalist discourse, and these rugged ideals of Christian manhood really only make sense within this Christian nationalist framework. This idea of Christian America, and you need strong Christian men to fight to defend Christian America.